Okay, so thank you very much for having me. I'm going to present today a paper that is called The Transmission of Keynesian Supply Shocks, which is joint work with Andrea Ferrero. And everything I say are my own views and not those of the Bank of England. So the paper is actually quite related to Florin's paper that's been just presented. And it has to do with basically how supply shocks can behave sometimes as aggregate demand shocks or can lead to aggregate demand deficiencies. But before getting to the meat of the paper, let me just tell you what is a Keynesian supply shock. It's been briefly mentioned by Florin in his presentation. And so the notion of a Keynesian supply shock comes from this very influential paper by Guerrieri, Lorenzoni, Straub, and Werning. And so to tell you a little bit how we think about it, let me just give you a very simple example. Okay? To do that, I need to think of a two-sector economy where my two sectors are going to be cinemas and popcorn. Okay? And so in that sense, it's different from Florin's paper. Here we have different goods and different sectors. Florin was talking about an aggregate shock with a variety of a single good. Now, think of a negative supply shock that affects cinemas. Clearly, it's kind of spurred by the COVID experience. And so what the shock is going to do in that sector is going to create an excess demand for cinemas, which is going to lead to an increase in the price of cinemas. So nothing really strange here. The question is what happens to popcorn, okay? And the answer to this question crucially depends on what you assume about the complementarity and substitutability between these two goods. So if you assume substitutability, then you're going to have that consumers are going to switch from cinemas to popcorn. This is going to create excess demand for popcorn, which is going to lead to an increase in their price, okay? However, if you have complementarity between cinemas and popcorn, so you like popcorn only when you are at the cinema, then I don't want to eat popcorn because I can go to the cinema, which is going to lead to a deficient demand for popcorn and therefore a fall in the price of popcorn. Okay? So in this respect, this is different from the example that Florin gave you before in his presentation, which was more about cinemas and Netflix. Okay? So within the cinemas kind of realm, then you can have substitutability between cinemas and Netflix. Here we're talking about two different goods, okay? Now, if this complementarity, if this effect is strong enough, you can already imagine that what originated as a sectoral supply shock in cinemas is going to lead to an aggregate demand deficiency. So if you are a macroeconometrician and you just look at aggregate data, you're going to look at something that looks like an aggregate demand shock with output falling and prices falling as well. And that's what we refer to as the Keynesian supply shock. So it's a sectoral shock with an aggregate demand deficiency that transmits in this very specific way. Okay? Now the Guerrieri-Lorenzoni, the Guerrieri et al. Paper is much more complicated, but this is really the key intuition. The complementarity is really the ingredient that you need to get some of the effects they talk about. Okay, now that we know what the Keynesian supply shock is, let me tell you what we do in the paper. So the question we try to answer is extremely simple, is, given this beautiful theory and this kind of mechanism that has been developed in this theory paper, do we have any evidence on the presence of these Keynesian supply shocks in the data? Can we offer any evidence on the way in which, these shocks, whether they exist and how they transmit? The way in which we're going to try and answer this question is with a two-step approach. We're going to start with an empirical application, which is going to be based on a multi-sector factor augmented VAR, where we're going to use sectoral data. Of course, you already got that, with aggregate data, excuse me, there is no way in which you can answer this question, so we're going to go straight to sectoral data. And in the second step, we're going to instead exploit the predictions from a new Keynesian model with a production network to try and understand and interpret the results that we have in the empirical part of the paper. I said production network. You're maybe already thinking about it. We're going to allow in the theory bit of the paper for complementarities just both in production and in consumption. So the example before, it's a clear complementarity in consumption goods, but we're also going to allow for complementarities in production, by which I mean if I need intermediate inputs, these intermediate inputs may be complementary as well, which is a thing that makes quite a lot of sense, both in theory and in the data. So what we find is that the data are indeed consistent with this Keynesian supply view, and importantly, and quite strikingly, we find that this is a general feature of business cycles. So despite being motivated by COVID, of course, all our analysis is going to be run on pre-COVID data. And so we're going to try and see whether this kind of transmission mechanism is important to think about business cycle fluctuations, and the answer to us is yes. And in the theory part of the paper, we actually highlight some additional ingredients that, additional in terms of relative to complementarities, that can actually lead to this Keynesian supply transmission mechanism. And in particular, we're going to highlight the role of price stickiness and also the position of the sector that's been shocked with a negative supply shock within the production network. Whether you are very upstream or very downstream within the production network is going to matter, as I'm going to show you in a second. Okay, so before getting into the kind of details of what we do empirically, let me just give you the intuition for what is the challenge for doing what we want to do and how we try and address it. So the challenge is that Keynesian supply shocks and aggregate demand shocks, as a government spending shock or a discount factor shock in our DSGs, imply the same restrictions on aggregate data, right? Because both shocks, if you just look at aggregate output and prices, are going to lead to co-movement of these two variables conditional on that specific shock. However, these shocks imply different restrictions on sectoral data, and that's exactly the intuition we're going to try and exploit here to provide evidence on the existence of these Keynesian supply shocks. Think about an aggregate demand shock, and just for sake of argument, think of a discount factor shock in my previous model economy with cinemas and popcorn. If I want to consume less of these goods, I'm going to consume less of both cinemas and popcorn. The prices of these two goods are going to fall, possibly in a heterogeneous fashion because the cinema sector is larger, because I have some kind of asymmetry in my preferences, but both quantities and prices are going to fall. Differently, if the Keynesian supply shock is at the origin of this aggregate co-movement between output and prices that I observe in the data, are going to see that at least in some sectors, and these are the sectors that have been hit by the sectoral supply shock, output and prices are not going to co-move, are going to move in different directions. While those that have been indirectly affected by these complementarity effects are going to co-move, we're going to see co-movement between output and prices. Okay? So the sectoral response here is key. Okay? The way in which sectoral output and prices respond to something that looks like an aggregate demand shock is going to be key to understand whether we live in 1 and 2. So in other words, and in practice, what we do is something that is extremely simple. We recover from aggregate data something that until yesterday you would have called an aggregate demand shock, a shock that leads to co-movement between aggregate output and aggregate inflation. Once I have this shock, I'm going to look how each sector in the US economy is going to respond to this shock. And the way in which output and prices in those sectors are going to respond is going to help me disentangling between whether we live in a world that is simply dominated by one, so the aggregate shock that I identified from aggregate data, it's a true aggregate shock, or whether instead there is some evidence or something else going on. Okay? So that's the key intuition. I'm going to formalize exactly what I do in a couple of slides. But Dimitri, if you have a question.
Fine question. So I have in mind the following effect of aggregate demand shock. So I become poor, and say I switch from eating oysters to eating potatoes. And so I think your question is a very valid one, and I think the answer to the question depends at which level of granularity you're going to drill down into the sectoral evidence. So I think you're going a bit more in Florin's direction, meaning, within cheeses, within the sector of cheeses, there is the cheddar cheese or the fancy Parmigiano that's been seasoned for 24 months. I can switch within variety, and I think you live in a substitutability world in that respect. Our level of disaggregation is something like legal services and truck transportation, or production of, it could be other services like administrative services and passenger transportation. So it's harder to believe that there is this type of phenomena you're describing at that level of disaggregation. But I think the key is how granular you go with your sectoral data. So clearly
in terms of like where does the paper fit into the broader discussion, we already mentioned this paper by Guerrieri et al. Actually, for those of you who like are in the open economy literature, this older paper by Corsetti et al. Made exactly the same points in an open economy context, but the intuition was very much there for those who look at international macro. We are very much related to the literature on granular fluctuations and the role of production networks in propagating granular shocks or shocks to a given sector, to the broader economy, and also to a large number of papers that looked at supply versus demand shocks in the pandemic. Really, what we do here is to try and we do actually two things. The first one is to try and see whether these Keynesian supply shocks do exist in the data or whether we can provide any evidence on them. And secondly, we also provide some kind of theoretical insights on what are the ingredients that can generate those Keynesian supply shocks. Okay, let me get to the meat of the paper. So the way in which we do our empirical analysis by means of a factor augmented VAR for many sectors of the US economy. So I is going to denote a sector here, and start with an extremely simple VAR for a given sector, where we're going to model sectoral output and sectoral inflation with a very simple VAR1 with some reduced form innovations. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to assume a factor structure for the reduced form innovations of the sectoral VAR, and this is kind of obvious because your sectoral dynamics are affected by aggregate shocks as well as sectoral shocks. So that's what we do here. We add a factor structure to the reduced form residuals, where you have an unobserved vector of common factors Ft, as well as some unobserved idiosyncratic or sectoral innovations UIT. Now, there is a very important point to make here, which is a bit of a subtle one, which is the following. The common factors Ft, if you try and estimate with any methodology to extract factors from a large set of data, is certainly going to capture truly aggregate shock. So if there is an aggregate TFP shock, is going to end up being in Ft because this shock is going to affect all sector, maybe heterogeneously, and we allow for heterogeneity here with these loadings. But definitely it's going to affect all the sectors and it's going to be captured by Ft. However, if there is such an object or such a thing, which is a sectoral shock that propagates through the economy and affects all sector in an heterogeneous fashion, this sectoral shock, this granular shock, is also going to be captured by Ft. Okay? The factor model literature doesn't allow you to separate what's the granular shock that eventually spills over to the rest of the economy versus a truly aggregate shock. So all of this to say that the object of interest is going to be this Ft, this vector Ft, and not the UIT. The UIT you should think of either idiosyncratic noise or those sectoral shocks that don't manage to propagate through the economy, okay, that stay confined in that sector or a couple of neighboring sectors, okay? But the key object is to recover this Ft guy, which then we're going to look at, okay? So how do we get Ft, given that Ft is unobserved? We're going to use an identification and methodology that we developed in a recent paper that we published last year with Ashim Pesaran and Alessandro Rebucci, which I'm not going to explain because I don't have time to do so. But the intuition is that you can approximate the factors with cross-sectional averages of the observables. Okay? We show in that paper that this method is absolutely equivalent to doing principal components or more fancy dynamic factor models. But there's going to be one key advantage in using cross-sectional averages that is going to become clear in a second. Okay? So I'm gonna skip all the derivations for why we can do this, but just believe me or check in the paper. You can basically rewrite this equation with this equation, where I substituted for Ft cross-sectional averages. These are the X bars of the output growth and inflation at the sectoral level. So think of these as being aggregate output and aggregate inflation, both contemporaneous and lagged. Okay, and so now the key object of interest is going to be the loading, this loading to the contemporaneous factors, if you want, or a proxy for the factors. Okay, so this is kind of very easy. We solved a problem which is we didn't know how to recover these unobserved factors. Now we have some observables for it. There is an additional problem though. How do we interpret these factor loadings to the common factors x bar t? And the reason why this is complicated is because these are aggregate output and inflation, and these two variables are correlated in the data. So if you do PC, if you do principal components, you get some objects that are orthogonal from each other, and so you can interpret them very easily. You can interpret the loadings very easily. What's the cost of doing principal components is that you have no idea what you're looking at. These are statistical objects. They are orthogonal by definition, but we cannot interpret them, okay? And so here's the beauty of the approach we developed. How can we transform this object in a way that we can interpret it in a structural way or in a meaningful way? Factors are always identified up to a rotation matrix, so you can basically rotate these factors as much as you like. And what we do here, we rotate this variable, these cross-sectional averages, with the structural VAR. So you take the x bar t, so imagine this is a super simple VAR in aggregate output inflation. You do your preferred identification scheme that you want, and then you simply, once you estimated this aggregate VAR, you take xt and you plug it back in here, which gets you to this expression here, okay? So now in my sectoral VARs, I don't have anymore the x bar t, I have some orthogonal innovations to the factors, et, which are orthogonal like PCs, but on top of it, I actually know what they are. I can name them, I can say, well, I identify an aggregate supply and aggregate demand shock from these objects, and so now I can look at how sectors respond to an aggregate demand and an aggregate supply shock. If you've done PCs, you could see how sectors respond to these factors, but you have no idea what the factors are. Okay, so that's the advantage of what we do, and that's why we think is a useful way to think about this factor model. And let me mention again that these ETs that we're going to recover from a very simple aggregate VAR is going to contain both true aggregate shocks as well as sectoral shocks with aggregate effects, as per the point that I explained in the previous slide. Please.
So how is this different from getting shocks that you will get from aggregates?
Say again? Which shocks?
Let's say you get aggregate inflation and aggregate GDP growth, and then recover the shock from this.
So that's exactly what we do. So the first step is some kind of econometrics 101 VAR with two variables, with aggregate variables, with aggregate output and inflation. We're going to use sign restrictions to recover two shocks from this super simple bivariate VAR. And then I'm going to get to it, but for each rotation of the sign restriction procedure, you get one of these E's, you put it back here, you estimate this lambda I, which is eventually what we care about. That's the main object of the empirical analysis, and then we construct distribution as usual with the sign restriction procedure. So
the relationship between xi and x bar, so there is no relationship. So these are to be different variables.
In principle, yes. What we do eventually is to just we use. So I guess your question is, can you have in x bar t something more than aggregate output and inflation? And yes, you could add, other type of aggregate variables such as, typically in macro we use the excess bond premium and so on, and you can do that, and we do that in robustness.
X bar is not standing for an average of the x.
No, x bar is the cross-sectional average of the output of the inflation and the outputs.
Okay, but you can add something else.
But you can add something else. So if needed, it turns out that it's not needed. You can check. Basically, if these guys need to be cross-sectionally weakly correlated for your factors to be soaking up all the co-movement across sectors, and it turns out that just with the cross-sectional average of output and inflation, you do that in a good way. Please.
Sorry, these X bar are weighted average or just a simple cross-sectional average?
They're weighted averages, and we use the output weights over total outputs. But if the number of sectors is large enough, then you could do simple averages. And asymptotically, if there is no dominant sector, if there is not a sector that is 99% of the economy, it doesn't matter. And we actually show it in the paper that it doesn't matter whether you were to use simple averages. Okay, let me show you some results. So the data we use are quarterly gross output and its deflator growth rates at sectoral level from the BEA. This is how the data looks like. These are the YITs. If you take a weighted average and you compare it with true aggregate output growth from national accounts, you get, not surprisingly, you get exactly the same chart. Okay, so in our bivariate VAR, we're going to use this series and this series for inflation. Okay, and it's super simple bivariate VAR, which is in this equation. Let me just go quickly. We do some restrictions, as I mentioned, and we define an aggregate demand-like shock as a shock that leads to positive co-movement between output and inflation, and a supply shock as the shock that leads to negative co-movement between these two variables. Why demand-like? Well, because hopefully it should be clear by now, if Keynesian supply shocks exist, then this shock is going to be a linear combination of two things. It's going to be truly aggregate demand shocks as well as sectoral shocks that hit a given sector and eventually look like an aggregate demand shock to the eye of a macroeconometrician like me. Okay? We do inference in a very standard way, and so as I mentioned before, for each rotation and each draw of this aggregate VAR, we then go back to the sectoral VAR, 64 of them. We estimate 64 loadings. We go back here, second draw, and so on. And we do 5,000 draws of rotations. So that's exactly what we do. For imagine we are at draw 1, we have got an estimate of these E's, so E hat. We can estimate our lambda I. And that's basically what we do in the empirical model. Now, the key question, which I hope I explained already before, is how do sectoral output and inflation co-move in response to these demand-like shocks that we identify? If all these sectors are co-moving, then we say, well, we have aggregate demand shocks that behave as they should, and full stop, we end the paper. If we instead find that there are some sectors that have output and inflation moving in different directions, we may have something more. So how do we look at this? Oh, sorry, this is exactly what I just said. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to plot the loadings of output and inflation to these aggregate demand-like shocks. And I'm going to pool all the loadings across all draws and all sectors. So I'm going to have 5,000 draws and 64 sectors. And I'm going to just plot distribution of these loadings, which I have here. So on the left-hand side here, you have the loadings on output growth. So I took a negative aggregate demand-like shock. So these loadings are all negative. There are a couple of counter-cyclical sectors, so I normalize those loadings, which implies that I'm going to normalize also the inflation loadings. Okay, so this is just a very harmless normalization. I want to look at output going down, because at the end of the day, what I care about is the co-movement between these things. So what happens to the inflation loadings? This is what we get. So what we get is that for our 64 times 5,000 draws numbers of loadings, at least 40% of them lie in the wrong side of the distribution, in a sense. They are positive. So there is a lot of cases in which an aggregate demand-like shock that reduces aggregate output and reduces sectoral output leads to an increase in inflation in many of these sectors. How do we think about this? We think this is not consistent with the strict view of aggregate demand shocks. And we also think that basically the VAR is mislabeling what we called, or until yesterday, what I would have called an aggregate demand shock, a Keynesian supply shock or a sectoral supply shock that transmits through the economy with this complementarity at play. And so we think that this evidence is actually supportive of the Keynesian supply view of the transmission of shocks. Now, is this driven by outliers? Are we just taking the tails of the distribution? Let me show you two examples. So I'm plotting here the full distribution of loadings for the 5,000 draws at this stage at the sectoral level. The accommodation sector is a sector that behaves in a normal way, if you want. So you have that output falls by definition. We normalized it to fall. And all the inflation loadings are actually negative. Okay? The apparel and leather and allied product sector, which you probably never heard of, and neither did I before doing this paper, instead, interestingly, has inflation loadings that fall entirely on the right side of the distribution. So we're not talking about these things not being statistically significant or picking up some kind of tail behavior. We have 16 out of 64 sectors that behave in this way. We have statistically significant inflation responses for positive inflation responses for a fall in output. So we've done a lot of kind of robustness on our empirical analysis, and the results, if anything, are even stronger in some of these exercises. Let me, how much do I have, sorry?
15.
15, perfect. I want to cover the kind of theoretical part because I think is quite insightful to try and understand what's going on here. Because, what I showed you so far is really a possibility result, right? There could be other things going on. Unfortunately, I'm not going to prove anything, but I'm gonna show you some results from a laboratory experiment using this DSG that, still within the realm of possibility result, I think are quite interesting and telling. Okay, so what do we do in this part of the paper? So the objective is to validate and interpret these distribution charts that I just shown to you. And the way in which we're going to do it is to develop a multi-sector DSGE model with a production network that we borrowed basically from these two papers, which are really nice. And what are the features of this model? You have heterogeneity in price stickiness. You have an asymmetric input-output matrix, exactly as we have in the data. And we can allow for complementarities both in consumption and in production. So it's a relatively general way of thinking about sectoral spillovers of shocks. So the beauty is that we can design our model to match exactly the data that we have from the BEA. Okay, so we basically are going to write down a model for 64 sectors. We're going to use the BEA input-output linkages that were not used at all in the empirical part of the paper to calibrate the production network. So we can calibrate how much you use from a sector that is upstream to you and how much other sectors use of your intermediate goods. And you can control the degree of complementarity between these intermediates. And then you have final consumption goods, and again you can control the complementarity between these goods. We can calibrate the frequency of price adjustment using BLS data. So for each sector, Michael Weber has done a lot of work on that and was very kind to share the data with us. So for each sector, you have an heterogeneous and sector-specific frequency of price adjustment. And then, we thought, when it came to kind of thinking about how to calibrate this elasticity of substitution between intermediates and final goods, at the beginning we thought, okay, let's use this as a thing with vary in the model, but we ended up fixing it to parameters that are quite established in the literature. I'm citing here two papers by Bakai and Fari, but there is actually quite a lot of super interesting literature looking at that. And there is quite a lot of agreement that the numbers for complementarity are strong. There is strong evidence for complementarity for intermediates. And that's not really the case for final goods. So we took, if you want, a relatively conservative stance here by assuming Cobb-Douglas for consumption goods. So this is our model. What's the nature of the experiment we run? So what we're going to do is to simulate sectoral data, and we're going to assume different configuration of shocks driving our model economy. So you can think the economy being driven just by sectoral shocks, or just by aggregate shocks. But then basically with the model you can simulate the same sectoral data for gross output and its deflator that we have in our original empirical analysis. And then we're simply going to estimate our factor model on the simulated data. And with this different experiment we may be able to draw some conclusions about how to interpret our empirical analysis. Okay, so the first experiment we do is to simulate the data conditional on sectoral TFP shocks. So there is no aggregate shock whatsoever. The only thing that drives the model economy is a matrix of 64 by 64 uncorrelated shocks in each sector, which at each period hit the model economy and lead to dynamics in the economy that are fairly complicated. So basically we get this simulated series for output and inflation. And the first thing that we do, when we apply our empirical methodology to the simulated data, and which was very interesting from my side, is the sign restriction procedure going to capture any aggregate demand type of shock in these simulated data? And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, I don't know, but the answer is yes. It takes very little to the sign restriction procedure to find something that resembles an aggregate demand shock, which actually explains up to 50 or 60% of output fluctuations, okay? Which is quite stunning, right? There is no aggregate demand shock whatsoever in the data, just TFP shocks, and I take aggregate output and inflation by aggregating the simulated data at a sectoral level, and my VAR gives me a very big demand shock driving the model, driving the economy. So that's already kind of going in the right direction. The second step, once we identify this aggregate demand shock, is to look at the loadings as we've done before. And this is what we find. So what I'm having in these charts are the factor loadings on the aggregate demand-like shock. In this case, is really not an aggregate demand shock, is something else. For output and inflation with the same normalizations as before, and so on. And so what you get is that we get a very similar share of loadings of inflation that fall on the wrong side of the distribution, on the positive side, and also a roughly similar number of sectors whose inflation loadings are fully on the positive side of the distribution. So this is the number of sectors with statistically significant, if you want, inflation loadings that are positive.
In the DFD, the sectoral
DFD shocks are IID across sectors?
They are IID across sector. They are persistent within the sector.
I see. So so what this is saying is there's something fundamental about the input-output matrix that makes some sectors behave as supply shocks.
Exactly. So because we're abstracting, if you want, from complementarity and consumption.
Right.
And so, it's really coming from the production network that, somehow these idiosyncratic shocks travel through the production network and lead to aggregate dynamics that resemble an aggregate demand shock. And not just noise. 60% of the variance is from a model economy that had no aggregate demand shock whatsoever in it. Okay?
And you're going to show us what in the structure?
Yes, I get to that. Let me skip this. You can also think of sectoral demand shocks. This is very specific to a point in a paper by Bakai and Fari, but let me just skip this. What I really find kind of fascinating is when instead I simulate my model conditional on aggregate demand shock. So what I do here, I do a discount factor shock, as we've done all of us in standard DSG models, in single sector DSG models. And so I simulate again my sectoral output and inflation, I aggregate them, I estimate the aggregate VAR. Not surprisingly, this time the VAR finds that the aggregate demand shock explain virtually 100% of the data. So that's all kind of in line with what you would expect. And this is the type of distributions we get. So we get, as I was kind of hinting at the very beginning in the cinema's popcorn example, for a negative aggregate demand shock that decreases output in all sectors, inflation in all sectors is going to fall. Okay? So again, I haven't proven anything. It's still a possibility result, but I find these charts really kind of insightful in terms of trying to interpret the kind of very indirect approach we had in the empirical methodology, which is to us, maybe the unique way to go and find these shocks in the data.
Nice if you take a shock that is a demand shock, an exogenous demand shock, that take a high frequency monetary policy shock, and apply your methodology that described before, do you find exactly the same? Do you find something that is comparable to the demand shock this type of
yeah,
like a placebo type of?
That's actually a good idea. That's something you can think of. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes?
Do you get sectors that lie consistently on one side, on the wrong side of zero like this? In this?
Let me get to this because I think is my last point really, which is okay, this is by 5 minutes, perfect. So all these results are pooling all sectors, all draws, right? Let's try to think a bit more about what's driving, who's on the right side of the distribution. And clearly, in the data, there are many things going on. There is no such a thing as the economy being driven by sectoral TFP shocks only. There are so many other shocks that contaminate things. So we thought, let's use the model for that for a second. And so the question I'm going to ask now is, if I shock a single sector with a sectoral TFP shock, and I do it for all of the sectors in my model economy, which of these shocks is going to generate the Keynesian supply transmission? Okay? So the answer to this question is, I plug in the TFP shock in my sector, I look at the response of aggregate inflation in my economy, so I aggregate up the various deflators, I can look at how aggregate inflation behaves, and so if for a negative TFP shock in a given sector, I see that aggregate inflation is falling, then I know that that sector can generate a Keynesian supply transmission. And what I do this for all the sectors, and then I also try and see what dimension of heterogeneity in the model is associated with this Keynesian supply transmission. So let me, before you look at the kind of labels, let me tell you what is on the y and on the x-axis. On the y-axis, you have the aggregate inflation response. So this is typically positive, but in some cases is negative. So this means that when it's negative, you have a Keynesian supply shock, because you have that a sectoral TFP shock in a sector has led to a fall in aggregate inflation. And the filled circles are, each circle is clearly a sector, and the filled circles are those who generate this Keynesian supply transmission mechanism. Okay, are you with me? On the x-axis, I'm going to plot heterogeneity, different dimensions of heterogeneity. So the first one that I think is the easiest to think about is sticky prices. Sectors, price stickiness is heterogeneous across sectors. So I can scatter plot how often you adjust prices against how strong was the inflation response for the sectoral shock that hit in your sector. And what do we find here? We find that if you're very sticky, okay, and you're hit by a sectoral TFP shock, it's more likely that you have an aggregate fall, a fall in aggregate inflation, sorry. What's intuition is super simple. Go back to the cinemas popcorn example. Cinemas are hit by the supply shock. Imagine that the price of cinemas is fixed. Prices are not going to go up, okay? With complementarity, popcorn's price is going to fall. Now, CPI is simply a weighted average of these prices, so it's more likely that the fall in popcorns now is going to lead to a fall in aggregate inflation than if instead cinemas prices were very flexible and you had a massive shoot in the price of cinemas. So the more sticky, the less Keynesian supply shocks you have. Sorry, the more flexible, the less. Okay? Here is another very interesting fact. So what I'm plotting here is a measure that is called downstreamness, which means how much, imagine that you're all sectors, how much do you rely on my intermediates? Okay? If you rely very little, you're down here. If you rely very much, you're up here. Take again the example of cinemas. Cinemas don't produce intermediates, so you rely, my intermediate input or my intermediate good is not needed by anyone else. It turns out that if the shock hits cinemas, you're more likely to have a Keynesian supply shock. So what's the intuition for that? Again, it's quite simple. I'm the one hit by the supply shock, and you use my intermediates. If you use my intermediates a lot, and my price has gone up a lot, then your price is there is a force counteracting the fall in prices that is due to complementarity. Okay? So if you don't use my intermediates at all, then it's more likely they're going to be seeing a Keynesian supply shock. And the same is true with upstreamness, which is instead, I'm cinemas, how much intermediates on average I use from you guys, and it's a lot, of course. I need seats, I need electricity, I need the film and so on. And this means that the more I do so, the more I need your intermediates input, and I'm the one hit by the shock. I'm gonna be hit by your falling prices because there's this complementarity. So I'm hit by the shock. Your popcorn price fall. I use popcorn in my production function, and this drags down on my own price, which means that you're gonna see more Keynesian supply shocks here. So all of this to say that, importantly, heterogeneity in price stickiness as well as your position in the supply chain, whether you are very upstream and very downstream, matters a lot for generating this Keynesian supply transmission that has been highlighted. And so this is completely on top of complementarity. So I could plot these charts, this with our baseline calibration, but I could have assumed smaller or higher complementarity, and I would still get these patterns in the sectoral responses. And I'm done. So we think that the data are supportive of Keynesian supply shocks. The key intuition for the empirical analysis is that we think that aggregate VARs mislabel aggregate demand shocks, when in reality you have sectoral shocks that propagate in a way that looks like aggregate demand. I mean, this is important for a bunch of reasons, and let me just mention that now that we have a better understanding on A, the fact that these shocks, we think they exist, and B, we also know now a little bit more which sectors could generate those shocks. We're actually working on going straight to identify the sectoral supply shocks rather than doing this very kind of indirect approach to recover the existence of these shocks. So now the work we're doing is really to try and find either good instruments for shocks that hit certain sectors, and then check whether they spilled over to the aggregate economy in an aggregate demand-like fashion. And we're also doing some cross-country analysis. And I'll stop with that. Thank you very much.
So thanks so much for letting me discuss Ambrogio and Andrea's paper. I'm not Ambrogio's student, but I hope I will be able to work with him in the future. So let's hope after the discussion it's going to be fine. So I'm very happy that I got the chance to think more about this paper. So Ambrogio gave you the intuition with the cinema and popcorn example of what a Keynesian supply shock is. I'm going to report the definition from Guerrieri, Lorenzoni, Straub, and Wernig. And here I'm quoting. So they say a negative supply shock can trigger a demand shortage that leads to a contraction in output and employment larger than the supply shock itself. We call supply shocks with these properties Keynesian supply shocks. So that's the definition. So what are the questions that Ambrogio and Andrea are asking? First question is whether aggregate demand-like shocks in the data can be due to Keynesian supply shocks. Second question, if so, how big they are, given that we don't have evidence of this. And third, which economic features are important for the Keynesian supply shock propagation? And what is the challenge related to answering this question? Well, they are observationally equivalent at aggregate level. So we can't really disentangle them at first sight. So how are they going about answering this question? So to answer the first question, they are going to combine sectoral data, this is very important, with a novel empirical strategy to get support of the existence of these Keynesian supply shocks. And they do so laying out a multi-sector VAR model with a factor structure to capture the sectoral dynamics. With this multi-sector VAR model, they are going to aggregate the sectoral model to estimate common factors. With this, when they have this, after this aggregation, they are going to be able to extract aggregate demand and aggregate, at least aggregate-like demand shocks and supply shocks using sign restrictions. And with these aggregate shocks in hand, they are going to recover the loadings of the sectors to these identified shocks. And so the object of interest, what Ambrogio showed, are these sectoral loadings. And note that this strategy does not require to explicitly identify sectoral shocks, but depending on how they transmit at sectoral level, we are able to say whether these sectors are Keynesian, they give rise to Keynesian supply propagations. And this is different from, like, alternative to other methods like the one proposed by Gabex and Koyen, who use granular instruments, or other papers who rely on economic theory to identify the sectoral shocks. But I mean, Ambrogio said they're already doing work on this. So, second question, how relevant these Keynesian supply shocks are? Well, these sectoral loadings are, like, in 40% of the cases giving rise to Keynesian supply shocks. So it's like a big chunk of the aggregate-like demand-like shocks. So it's not something negligible like 3%, it's 40%. And here, yeah, I report the plot that Ambrogio showed us. Even if you have a negative output growth, some sectors are going to give rise to a positive response in inflation. And third answer, like, what are the important economic features giving rise to this propagation? Well, they look at four features: price stickiness and the position along the input-output network, downstreamness and upstreamness, and also how much intermediates are used, so the intensity. And they show that what matters for this propagation is the frequency of price adjustment. So the stickier the prices, the more Keynesian the supply shocks are. Then if you rely not much on sectors as intermediate, and instead if other sectors rely a lot on your production, this is what is important for a shock to be Keynesian. Okay, but let me give you my comments. So first comment is about complementarities. Well, complementarity is crucial for the Keynesian supply shock propagation. And in the model, they allow for both production and consumption, like complementarities in both production and consumption. So now, as we saw, these complementarities are calibrated to Banque and Fari to 2021, and they assume that, well, actually, in the case of consumption, there's Cobb-Douglas, so they're not really complements, and instead there is quite a bit of complementarity in the production. So my suggestion is to produce a chart as the other ones, also for complementarity, to study how the propagation really depends on the degree of complementarity, not just on the fact that, like, on the extensive margin in a sense, but also how much this complementarity affects the propagation. You could do some comparative statics in the model and some simulation. And also, you could think of whether it's important to have complementarities also in the consumption, whether this matters more or less or at all. Well, even more, you could try to use your data to estimate these parameters at sectoral level. I think it would be really cool also to understand the mechanism there. Finally, I think Banque and Fari show that complementarities actually amplify Keynesian spillovers from supply shocks, but they mitigate them from demand shocks. So I think, I don't know, if you manage to estimate this in the data, you could say whether this that Banque and Fari show is actually true in the data. My second comment concerns the asymmetries. So this is Ambrogio showed a plot of two sectors with the loadings for one sector which is not Keynesian, like with both loadings on the same side, and another sector which is Keynesian. Here there's a bunch of sectors which are all giving rise to Keynesian supply shocks. the difference is that there is a couple which are actually counter-cyclical, which is farms and I think credit intermediations. So here you have that the loadings for output growth is positive, while the loading for inflation is negative, while in the other sectors is the other way around. And since these are the distributions, I guess this is because they react counter-cyclically to shocks. So I was wondering whether you could actually use this information. So why are these two sectors responding differently? It was not very obvious to me what they have in common, like banks and farms. And my suggestion is whether this say anything about asymmetries. For example, whether there is room to explore whether the sign of the shock matters, yes, and the magnitude of the shock matters as well, especially given that you showed that price stickiness might play a role. Last thing you mentioned at the very end concerns global value chains. I thought now you have a very nice strategy to see whether there are Keynesian supply shocks. You could apply this to international analysis and see how much of foreign Keynesian supply shocks could be important, and whether there is a difference in terms of spillovers between foreign Keynesian supply and demand shocks. So to conclude, I think it's a great paper and proposes a smart empirical strategy to identify, but to quantify whether these shocks exist. They have very neat results that are not specific to COVID, but they really are a structural feature of the US economy. And I think they could give more evidence on complementarities across sectors, and maybe look at asymmetries in the sign and size of the shocks. And finally, I think there's potential to use this empirical strategy for cross-country analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Let's collect some questions.
Thank you very much. This very interesting paper. I had questions regarding the empirical strategy, in particular the aggregation of data. Can you, to what extent do you anticipate, a little bit goes to the discussion we had in terms of the granularity of the data, to what extent would it change your results? And particularly, could you use your DSG model to kind of make an experiment to see aggregating more, I mean, having you have the same number of sectors that in your data. If you had less or more, would you see what could be the results, and would that change the results or conclusions?
Hi, yeah. So very interesting paper. I think I asked already this question in the virtual, and I think you did something, but I think you skipped over that slide. So I'm still curious about this. And this is a point that applies actually to the Guerrieri et al. Paper too, but if one wants to measure it, I think is really kind of key. If I take a CES framework with two goods, two sectors, and each of them is produced with a linear production function, and I have a TFP shock to one good, that is isomorphic, I would say, to a preference shock to the aggregator, to the CES aggregator of those two goods. So in a sense, like calling that supply or demand, is what you're measuring this shock that could be either the preference or the TFP shock? And then, I mean, I guess it's about, should we really call this a supply shock? Or is it just a sector-specific shock? Or is it, and this may be the slide that you skipped, is there a way to actually disentangle this? And I would find that super interesting.
Thank you. So very interesting paper. So I was thinking if in the empirical part, if it would be possible to extend the identification to include somehow the IO structure and like get some idea of so using the IO coefficient, right? So if you could aggregate the shocks of some sectors, so whether like if you are downstream or upstream, like you can basically like tell apart the aggregate shock from shocks to the upstream and the downstream. So basically like extend that identification equation with some weighted average of the upstream and downstream sectors from which you source. Thanks.
Comment. It's actually very related. So I actually wrote a paper with exactly that structure, kind of at the same time. But the reason why I bring that up is because in that paper, although it's, you can also call it a supply shock, the co-movement of inflation and output is not as the one you've been using in the paper. So what I'm trying to say is, it seems like it's the co-movement is a sufficient condition for a supply shock, but not a necessary condition. So what I'm trying to say is, there are sectoral shocks, and I also agree with you. I hate the terminology because I find it confusing, but it's just about whether it amplifies or not, but not about the nature of the shock. But so what I'm trying to say is, it seems that these sectoral shocks, not all of them will generate the co-movement that you're using. And the other thing is, toward the very end, you pointed out the policy implication, and I think the right question is, what should you do when you see inflation going up in this model?
So I'm glad that finally top economists realized that aggregate shock might hide sector level shock. I think it's a good thing. So they have like two comments. First, you don't really need sticky price for your story at all. No? I mean, the complementarity story must be enough to, if you were generating data from RBC model without sticky price whatsoever and running your identification, you'll find also aggregate demand shock, right? So that's my first question. And my second question is that usually we care about aggregate demand shock because we can do something about that. Is this the case that for those Keynesian supply shock, can you do something about them in the same way? I mean, do they have the same welfare implication and so on? I'm not sure that there is a proper answer yet.
I just want to repeat my question. Does the model replicate that distribution of having some sectors on the one side and then the others on the other? It seems like because the negative co-movement results in response to the supply shock in the sector where the supply shock hits, and therefore gives the co-movement with aggregate output whenever that sector is important, you should have a relatively equal distribution of negative and positive coefficients within sectors in your model.
Okay, so thanks a lot for the many questions, and especially to Anna for the very nice discussion. Let me try and group some of the points. So let me just start with Anna. So I think you have a couple of great suggestions on the open economy dimension to it, like the GVCs is absolutely, actually that's the first thing that Alberto told me when I sat down. So it's very welcome suggestion. I think we should definitely do some work on it. On your point about thinking about how complementarity shapes the transmission of shocks, we kind of shied away a little bit from that because it's kind of the main point of the Guerrieri et al. Paper. While we wanted to highlight our novel kind of theoretical mechanisms, which are the position in the supply chain and price stickiness. But we actually have done some work on that dimension, and in line with what you would expect if you believed the Guerrieri et al. Theory. Just one summary statistic I can give you: if you increase complementarity, the variance explained by aggregate demand-like shocks in the world where demand-like shocks are just driven by TFP shocks goes up massively. And so the more complementarity you have, the more the sun-restricted VAR thinks, oh, there is a lot of aggregate demand shocks, and that exactly goes that direction. So we kind of stopped there. It just reinforces the point that Guerrieri et al. Do, which we totally buy. And just one thing, you mentioned, how important these shocks are. That's a question that we really would like to try and answer. Unfortunately, just to be clear on what the paper does is something a bit less, in the sense that we think that we show that these shocks exist, but we are still far away to say how important they are. So, and you know, the distribution charts I showed you before, you know, this number of wrong loadings are indicative, but you know, shouldn't be taken really as saying these shocks matter a lot for business cycle fluctuation. So it's just a word of caution in terms of how to interpret those distribution charts. But again, thanks a lot for the very nice suggestions. I'm going to link to Basil's points on, you know, complementarity and sticky prices. So you can actually get, in an RBC version of the model, you can definitely get the same type of Keynesian supply transmission. The stickiness for us, again, is a novel kind of ingredient that helps you amplifying this Keynesian supply transmission, but it's not needed at all. If I gave that impression, I hope I didn't, because that's not what I meant. And on your question about you know, policy, of course, that's the really important question. We have very little to say about it, but you can easily think how, you know, the standard policy prescription for an aggregate demand shock that moves out to prices in the same direction might probably be different if this co-movement instead is generated by a supply disruption in some given sectors. And you know, some people worked on these issues during the pandemic. We really don't touch on it. It's something that definitely, in our view, deserves a lot of attention going forward. Let me get back then to Sakis and Florin's point about, can I put up my slides by any chance? Yes. Okay, so this is a point that, you know, I had to discuss a few months ago a paper by Banque and Fari on the transmission of the COVID shock through the production network. And unfortunately, the discussion didn't happen because of a bunch of reasons. But this is a point that I'm still a bit confused about myself in their framework. So in our framework, I understand the point relatively well. So I guess you both pointed to the fact that, you know, in a given sector, you can have a TFP shock, of course, but you can also have a movement in the weight that controls, you know, how much I like the product in that sector, the good in that sector, sorry, relative to other sectors. And that's exactly what we do. You know, we simulate the model under preference shocks, where preference here means preference for a given specific good in that sector. And this is what we get. So the first thing we get is that the aggregate VAR, when it tries to recover aggregate demand shocks from the simulated data, finds a much lower share of aggregate demand shocks driving output. So I gave you before a number. When it was for TFP shocks, I would get something between 50 and 60% of output fluctuations explained by demand shocks. If I were to simulate the data under these guys, I get a number that goes from 10 to 20. Okay, so there is clearly something that leads to less aggregate co-movement between output and prices if you simulate under sectoral demand shocks than sectoral supply shocks. And also, if you look at these distribution charts, you can see that you get a much lower share of wrong loadings on the positive side of the distribution. So my intuition, and you know, I'm very happy to discuss because again, I'm not fully clear myself, but my intuition for why this happens is the following. If you have complementarity, and I suddenly dislike cinemas, okay, I consume less of cinemas, and the quantity and the price of cinemas are going to fall. Okay. Now, with complementarity, if I reduce my amount of cinemas, I also want less of popcorn. And this generates a deficient demand for popcorn, given that the production frontier has not moved, and so the price of popcorn is also going to fall. So in my view, I'm struggling to see, honestly, your point saying that the co-movement...
My point is that you chose to use that line at zero as in the identification, the moment that identifies the data. But like, look at your chart, like, 90% of the shocks are still demand shocks, but the co-movement or aggregate inflation and output is kind of the right one, the usual. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is like, it seems, and from your next slide, it seems like that if you see the wrong co-movement, the negative co-movement between output gap and inflation, that's a sufficient condition to identify a sectoral shock, but not necessary. Look at all the rest of the distribution. And it's not a naive observation because it does matter for policy. If you have to respond differently.
To me, sounds like a conservative condition. Certainly not sufficient, but conservative. But we can get back to this. I mean, I don't want to take too much time. But I'm very curious about this point because just to close the comparison with Bakai and Fari, I mean, in their model, and Anna, you mentioned that there is a bit of a kind of different result in that this complementarity dampens shocks, dampen the amplification and amplify it depending on which shock you consider. The models are very different. And so they have a model with a zero lower bound, with sticky wages, and I mean, I really need to get to the nitty-gritty details of what they do to really understand the differences. Just quickly on the couple of additional points. There was your point about can we match the sectors in the empirics and in the data? Yes, we can, and indeed there is some overlap. So of the 16 sectors that we find, if you look at the shared loadings, we match roughly half of them. Let me mention though that in the data there are so many things going on that we can control in the same way in which we do in the DSG, right? Because in the data there are so many financial shocks and other kind of things that might lead to the same co-movement of aggregate supply and demand, but might blur a little bit. So in a sense, our shocks are not really identified. We're looking at a linear combination of shocks that give us the right co-movement between output and prices. So we can do the matching, and to some extent is there. My prior is actually, I was surprised by how much we can get, but I wouldn't push it too far. I'll stop.
Yeah, maybe we can continue discussion about that.
Thank you very much.